Welcome class. In this session, we'll discuss regarding generation and conduction of nerve impulse. So this nerve impulse will be conducted. So it will be generated depending upon the sensory neurons that are present in a body, and the nerve impulse that is generated, it will be conducted through the various neurons from one neuron to another. And in case of generation and conduction of the nerve impulse, so it can be explained in three different steps. One is resting state, action potential, as well as the repolarization. So we'll see the condition of the nerve membrane or the neural membrane when it is in a resting state. So suppose if we consider this nerve membrane, so when they are in a resting state, that means when they are not conducting the nerve impulse, so on the membrane, there will be presence of certain ion gated channels such as sodium and potassium gated channels, as well as the potassium pump. So here when the nerve impulse, they are not when the neuron is not involved in the nerve impulse conduction, so nerve membrane, it will be permeable. It will be permeable to that of the potassium ions rather than the sodium ions. This sodium potassium pump will be generally closed here. And here, if we see the charge of the neural membrane, so outside the neural membrane, it will be having a net positive charge, and inside the membrane, it will be having a net negative charge. And this is because this difference in the charge, electric charge, is mainly because, so outside the neural membrane, more number of sodium ions will be there compared to the inner membrane, and inner membrane will be richly occupied by the potassium ions as well as the negatively charged protein. So these are the components of the nerve membrane when it is in a resting state. So here, if we detect the charge of the nerve membrane with respect to the inner membrane, so it will be up to minus 70 millivolt, and this is called as resting membrane potential for the neuron. So that is regarding the resting state of the neuron. So here, the neuron membranes, it forms a separation between extracellular space around the neuron and its intracellular fluid, and membrane is mostly impermeable, forming a barrier to many proteins, molecules, and other ions dissolved in the intracellular and extracellular fluids. As a result, inner membrane obtains a net negative charge, and outside the membrane, it will be having net positive charge. And next, second step is called as depolarization or generation of action potential. So here, when the neuron is conducting the nerve impulse now, so what happens? So once the nerve impulse, once the signals, it reaches the axon ending or the nerve ending, so this impulse, it causes the opening of sodium potassium gated channels. Okay, and now the membrane becomes permeable. So as a result, membrane becomes permeable to sodium ions. So this results in influx of more and more sodium ions inside the membrane, and as a result, the neural membrane, the potential inside the neural membrane, it is going to change, and the charge goes on decreasing, and at one point it reaches the charge of minus, it goes on increasing, and it increases up to minus 55 millivolt. And this minus 55 millivolt, this is called as threshold potential. So this threshold potential, once it is reached, so now this potential is sufficient enough for the more and more influx of the sodium ions. So sodium ions diffuse into the membrane rapidly because of complete opening of sodium potassium pump. Okay, and as a result, the membrane, the neural membrane, it attains the net positive charge inside, and the charge will be negative on the outer side of the nerve membrane. And as a result, the potential, when at this point, when we determine the potential of the nerve membrane, so it can reach up to plus 30 millivolt, and this plus 30 millivolt, this is called as action potential. And here, the state of neuron where it attains net positive charge inside and negative charge outside. So this particular state of neuron, that is called as depolarized state. So this is called as depolarized state of a neuron. So once the action potential is generated in the neuron, so from the one region to another region, the impulse will be transmitted. Okay, it will be conducted. The same process occurs throughout the nerve membrane. And on the other side, if we see here, on the opposite side, the neuron, it tends to come back to its resting state. That is, as the impulse move in a forward direction, so in a backward direction, the excited neuron or depolarized neuron, they come back to the resting state. So that is called as repolarization. And during this, what happens is, so here when the excited neuron tends to come back to its resting state, so now again the membrane become impermeable to sodium as well as the potassium ion or sodium gated channels. So keeping the potassium gated channels open. So these channels will be closed so that the further influx of the sodium ions, it will be inhibited. Okay, and here the influx of potassium ion increases inside the membrane, and it is said that for every 2 potassium ions moving inside, 3 sodium ions, they will be pumped back by means of an active transport mechanism, that is by using ATP as an energy. Forcefully, for influx of every 2 potassium ions, 3 sodium ions will be pumped out. So this will be helpful in restoring the resting potential. So it helps in restoring the resting membrane potential in case of the neuron. So that is the charge inside the membrane. Once again, it becomes negative, and outside the membrane, it becomes positive, and the charge reaches to minus 70 millivolt. So this is called as resting state or the repolarization of the depolarized neuron. And here, if we see this graph, so initially it is in resting state, charge will be minus 70. And then as the charge increases to minus 55, that is called as threshold excitation. And further, the charge reaches to maximum, resulting in generation of action potential. And repolarization continues. And it is known that to certain extent, the charge may decrease below minus 70 millivolt, and again it comes back to the same resting membrane potential. And here, decrease in charge or fall of charge below minus 70 millivolt, that results in hyperpolarization. That is mainly because of active exflux of the sodium ions for the movement of every potassium ion into the membrane. So the membrane will be hyperpolarized, and again it comes back to the resting stage, and this is called as refractory period or the refractory index in case of the neuron. So that is regarding the refractory period that is seen during the nerve impulse conduction. So that is regarding how exactly the nerve impulse will be conducted throughout the neuron. So here, as the nerve impulse, it passes to the, it is conducted throughout the neuron. So finally, it reaches the axon terminal, and from one particular neuron, the impulse has to be transmitted to the adjacent neuron, and that can be explained through the synapse. So the synapse are the gap junctions that are found between the neurons. So these are the gap junctions between two neurons. It is called as neurons. It is called as synapse, and the space that is present between the two neurons, that is called as synaptic cleft. So here, in case of transmission of impulse, either it may be mediated through the chemicals or there may be direct transmission. So based on that, nerve impulse transmission are of two types. One is chemical synapse and another one is electrical synapse. So whichever may be the type of synapse, so in every synapse, there will be participation of two neurons. One is called as presynaptic neuron. which is going to receive the signal, and another one is the postsynaptic neuron. So this is postsynaptic neuron. So neuron which is present next to the synaptic cleft, that is called as postsynaptic neuron, and neuron that is present prior to the synaptic cleft, it is called as presynaptic neuron. So presynaptic neuron will be having a presynaptic membrane, and postsynaptic neuron will be having postsynaptic membrane. So now we'll see how exactly nerve impulse will be transmitted through the chemical synapse. So in case of chemical synapse, the nerve impulse from one neuron to another neuron will be transmitted through the chemical messengers. And these chemical messengers, they are called as neurotransmitters. So these are the chemical messengers. So these neurotransmitters, they are going to carry the nerve impulse from the presynaptic to postsynaptic neuron. So what is the mechanism involved in the chemical synapse, we'll see. So here, generation of action potential and reaching up of action potential in the presynaptic neuron, it leads to the depolarization of the presynaptic terminals. So this, upon depolarization of the presynaptic terminals, so it will act on the certain membrane vesicles that are present. As a result, the calcium gated channels will open. So this result in more and more influx of the calcium ions into the presynaptic vesicles. So these calcium ions that are released, so now it will act on the vesicles present in the neurotransmitter. So these are nothing but the Golgi vesicles itself. So these Golgi vesicles, once they are stimulated by the calcium ions, now these Golgi vesicles, they are going to release their neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. So these neurotransmitters, it come out of the synaptic presynaptic membrane by means of a simple diffusion, and they get accumulated in the synaptic cleft. So once this neurotransmitter comes to the synaptic cleft, in the postsynaptic membrane, there will be certain receptors or the channel receptors which will be complementary to this particular neurotransmitters. And once this neurotransmitters comes and binds to the receptors that are present in the postsynaptic neuron, so it results in the formation of the neurotransmitter receptor complex. So this neurotransmitter receptor complex, so now it results in change in the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron. As a result, action potential will be generated, and this action potential will be transmitted, or it will be propagated through the next cell. And once the action potential of the postsynaptic neuron is generated, again these neurotransmitters, they will be inactivated, or they will be transported back to the presynaptic terminal for the conduction of the second impulse that are generated in the presynaptic membrane. So that is regarding the mechanism of chemical synapse, where the impulse will be transmitted through the mediations of the chemicals that is called as neurotransmitters. And this neurotransmitter, they may be of two types, such as excitatory as well as the inhibitory. So excitatory are the one which are going to have a stimulatory effect. Inhibitory neurons, they will be neurotransmitters, they induce the inhibitory effect on the nerve functioning or the body functioning. So that is regarding the transmission of impulse through the chemical synapse. And next one is transmission of impulse through the electrical synapse. So this is also called as direct transmission. So here there will be no any mediation of the chemicals such as neurotransmitters. So directly the impulse from one neuron to another neuron will be transmitted. And in case of electrical synapse, if we see, so in between the two neurons, there will be no prominent synaptic cleft. Instead, there will be presence of the gap junction, or these are called as communicating junctions. So these communicating junctions, they are mainly represented by the node of Ranvier in case of the myelinated neuron. So mainly this electrical synapse can be seen in case of the myelinated axons, whereas non-myelinated axons, they undergo chemical synapse. So if we see in case of gap junctions, these are called as communicating junctions, where the adjacent cells, they are linked by means of a connecting tunnels, which are called as connections. So these connections, they will be helpful in the transmission of nerve impulse from one neuron to another, and the space between the, or the gap junction between the two neurons, will be very less here. So as a result, because of change in the membrane potential, so here the impulse can easily transmit it from one neuron to another neuron. And then coming to the electrical synapse. So here this synapse is abundantly found in case of the smooth and the cardiac muscles, and they permit unrestricted passage of small nutrient molecules between the cell. And action potential passes through the gap junction and depolarizes the postsynaptic cell. So there will be no presence of neurotransmitters which are causing depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane here. So that is regarding electrical synapse, or it is called as direct transmission of the nerve impulse. So this electrical synapse, they are rarely found, and they are the one where they are involved in the fast transmission of the nerve impulse compared to that of the chemical synapse, but they are rarely distributed in our body. So that is regarding the conduction as well as transmission of the nerve impulse. So in the next session, we'll be discussing regarding the structure and functioning of the brain parts in case of human in detail.